Welcome, everyone. My name is Hamid, and you are listening to and watching the Institute for Public Relations Measurement Commission video series that we're calling Measure Up. This video series is about the future of public relations, and more specifically, how the world of measurement and evaluation is evolving, especially given the current times, which are strange times indeed. So we're excited to have this conversation today with a dear friend, colleague, and really a go-to expert on healthcare communications in particular that I'm very excited to talk to. Alan, welcome.
Mo, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you, Alan, and we've got a lot to talk about today and a lot to unpack, as do many folks, right? There's a lot happening in the world. And,
busy times.
Our profession, of course, is playing a particularly central role in everything that's going on. But I think for our viewers, Alan, it would be really great to start out by talking a little bit about your career. You've had such an interesting journey from the in-house roles that you've played in the insurance and telecommunications industries, but also, of course, over the last several years, including at W2O, you've been working at some of the world's most renowned communications agencies. So tell us a little bit about this journey.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And a journey it's been indeed, that's for sure. I call it a meandering toward measurement, ultimately. But it's been by design. It may not have looked like there was a plan, but there's always been a plan. I've heard, I think it was Jeremiah Ouyang, call it a portfolio career, and I'll sort of unpack that for you in a minute. But you're right, I started out spending time in-house, big brand. I've spent some time at media content analysis shops, some time in academia, even creating and teaching courses, and now with big agency for the last decade. So, you know, the idea is that I sort of see all of those languages, I speak all those languages, if you like. And really the chronology is this, Mo. I've been in the industry a little over 20 years, 22, but who's counting now? Kind of a career in two halves. I started as a Marcom, Corpcom strategy guy, in-house, big brand, Bell Canada, sort of the AT&T of the North, where I was a generalist, a strategic comms planner. I got to work with folks in media relations, government relations, investor relations, employee comms, marketing, advertising, digital, so on and so forth. And so I didn't recognize it at the time, but gosh, it was amazing training for a broad strategic communications. And the fact that it was integrated with marketing at that time, this is 20 years ago, was sort of unheard of at the time. But in a planning role, I got increasingly irritated, frankly, doing all that absent data to shape the strategy, to optimize the content, to measure the results, that I switched sides. I was certainly seeing data coming through on the marketing side, the advertising side, but PR was sorely lacking. And so early 2000s, went back to grad school, ultimately focused all of my studies on the extent to which communications was or wasn't, more accurately, being informed by data. And so back to grad school, focused all my studies on that. And frankly, I had to look south of the border for, you know, super impressive people, super impressive body of research and content on that front, and enter stage left Institute for PR, don't you know, the Measurement Commission that you now lead and that I proudly am a member of. And so, you know, a decade ago, I became kind of a disciple and a booster for all things measurement, done well, done right, perfect blend of academia and, practical industry, commercial front. And so that ultimately switched sides, again, two halves of the career. It led me to the data dark side. First in the media content analysis capacity with a company called Cormex out of Toronto, which has just recently last year been bought by the Reputation Institute, RepTrack now. Andrew Lang over there is a former classmate of mine at the PhD level. And so I got my taste there for, brand attribute driven, reputation driven media analysis to shape communications strategy. I mean, the data don't lie. It was there in black and white. Here's what you should be doing more or less of. Then I spent some time at Hill & Knowlton in Canada, some time crafting and teaching courses at the grad level, some time consulting before ultimately crossing the border and realizing that everything we're doing in measurement south of the border in the US versus Canada, add a zero. It's an order of magnitude, just a much bigger land of opportunity. So I spent some time with Karma Media Analysis in Washington, D.C. before ultimately landing in back in big agency land, Fleischman Hillard for 6 years, and now W2O Group for the last 3. And I'll tell you just very quickly a little bit about us. The W2O Group is a near exclusively healthcare-centric agency. We're very much driven by the data. It's not just sort of my marketing hyperbole to say that, but we are a fully integrated marketing agency as well. But when I started, to give you a sense of scale, when I started with the company 3 years ago, we were 700 people. We're 1,400 now, so that's doubled in 3 years. It's bonkers. Wow. And 10% plus of those 1,400 people are in analytics, which speaks to kind of what we're doing. There's a lot of homegrown stuff here, proprietary built tools. So the founder of the company overinvested 10 years ago, a risk at the time, now not so much, in all things analytics. So, out of those 140 people, there are a lot of people with a lot of different specialties here. My particular focus, and why you and I are here today, is analytics to shape communications strategy, its brand and reputation measurement, and I ultimately lead W2O's relevance quotient, which we'll hint on a little bit later.
What a journey you've been on, Alan, and you said something that that really stood out to me, which was when you started your career working with a Canadian brand. At the time, marketing and communications was integrated, and what's so interesting about that is that history has a funny way of sort of repeating itself, because in many organizations today that is happening again, or it's already happened, which brings me to my next question about the change that we've seen in the public relations and strategic communications ecosystem over the many years. But at a high level, what do you think has evolved the most, and why do you think that might be?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, we could spend a weekend talking about it. So I picked out kind of 4 things that I think are most telling, most interesting to me anyway, and I'll unpack each of these 2 in turn. But the first is thankfully, a broadening of communications as a strategic management function, not just the party planners and the media relations folks and tactical afterthought. There's still a lot of that out there, unfortunately. The second is this shift away from, forgive the phrase, but spray and pray, and I'll tell you what we mean by that in a minute. Third is, and these are related, the foregrounding of the stakeholder, or reforegrounding. Kind of an old idea is new again, and what comes along with that is purpose, and all of this driven by data ultimately. So first, we're seeing ever more broadening of communications, thankfully, as a bona fide strategic management function. Goss, as an industry, as a discipline, we have pined for this for decades, and I think we're finally there. It's broadened as operational, not just storytelling. We're seeing ever more integration of the chief comms officer. Well, the evolution of the role of a chief comms officer in recent years is telling enough, let alone them integrating with a chief marketing officer and a chief tech officer, chief CIO is telling as to where all this is going. The second, we're seeing, and in fact, we're pushing, we're advocating clients real hard, this shift away from kind of the days of yore and yesteryear, this top-down command and control model of communication. We call it spray and pray. Spray a news release out, pray for coverage, hope for the best. Contrast that with a more community and conversation-driven approach, influencer-driven. So not one to many, but a few to a few at a time. So more targeted, more stakeholder-centric. And it's a model that thankfully acknowledges this idea that your brand, your reputation really isn't in your own hands. It's in the hands of your stakeholders. And at best, it's something you work with them to co-create and co-manage. And so I might also mention that related to this, we're seeing a shift away from stakeholders as bespoke, discrete groups. What I mean by that is employees, for example, aren't just employees. They're also customers, they're investors, they're influencers, they're advocates. In our case, they are patients. They're married to legislators, and on and on and on. So to treat them as strictly a narrow kind of vertical employee group is incredibly naive. We should be thinking about this in a far more complex way, which leads me to my third, and that is that this ever more foregrounding of the stakeholder. It's funny, to your point about what's old is new again, it seems that in the last couple of years, it's come back in fashion to use phrases like focusing on all stakeholders, not just the shareholder. Well, I mean, gosh, that's there was a letter a couple of years back that I think something like hundreds of CEOs signed in solidarity. That's cute, that's nice, but it's hardly a new idea. Certainly not in comms, not even in sort of business and management, academia in particular. There's a whole body of research around, stakeholder relationship management that's, gosh, 40, 50 years old. So in any event, it's come back into fashion. However it did or why, maybe doesn't matter so much as I think it's here to stay this time. And you'll see there's some really excellent research coming from Gartner that says, hey, your stakeholders are increasingly not just expecting, but demanding you as an organization stand up on an issue of societal, cultural, political currency and urgency. And so they expect it, they demand it, they'll even reward it in a variety of different ways. More importantly, they say that they're willing to help, they want to help, and if you give them something big enough to rally behind, something that's aligned with their values and purposes, then they'll get behind that. And so we're seeing, it leads me to sort of this idea of purpose. We're seeing that word an awful lot in the last 2 or 3 years in particular. It's always been kind of hanging around. It's been buzzy on the conference circuit, but it is, at the forefront now. And, I think historically it's been something that's been more said than done. It's been paid lip service, but not actioned necessarily. And I think generally in the last few years, recent events in particular are compelling organizations to really sort of embody these purposes and these values, which is my fourth before we get to talking about social injustice and COVID and such. But that all of these three, if you think of them as like pillars, they are underpinned by the foundation of data. Bringing it back here. So data enables all of this. Done right, it's telemetry, it's a way to help organizations navigate generally, and certainly as we think of the context of 2020, social injustice, COVID, that has upended everything. It's ever more important. So it's the data is increasingly at the center of everything we're doing.
Sure. One of the things that you and I have seen over the years, Alan, is the introduction, the reintroduction of various different frameworks that the public relations and strategic communications community uses just to make sense out of, what our role is, what our responsibilities are, what our lanes actually are from a scope and responsibility standpoint. We've seen so many things over the year. PESO, the Barcelona principles, which was just recently updated. Various different firms have started also releasing proprietary reports. The infamous Edelman Trust Barometer gets a lot of, I think, coverage for this reason, because it starts to get into the nuts and bolts of what practitioners need to actually start doing to think about trust. Which brings me to the recent report that you and your firm W2O released about the importance of relevance, especially in this era of social change and disruption. So I'd like to unpack this a little bit. With respect to the report, what does this report tell us about what relevance really means in today's day and age, and how brands can measure it?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you for that. I think before we get to that, I think I might need to sort of flip the script a bit and unpack what is relevance first, and then we'll talk about what is relevance in the context of social injustice, and then COVID a little later on. And so maybe I'll start here. I have this, it's getting cheesy and old now, but this cocktail party trick where you ask your average communicator to describe what they do to you in 25 or fewer words. It's fun. It'll typically take a drink or two, but you'll get there. And there are patterns. Typically, they'll give you some twist on this theme of projecting and protecting reputation, or improving, I suppose, in some cases too. And of course, they do that for all the right reasons. This is what strategic communications and strategic relationship management is really all about. It's continued license to operate. It's predisposing a marketplace to help marketing and advertising come along behind. I call that the PR Pied Piper. It's recruiting talent. It's preferred pricing with suppliers, customer preference, even market cap. So there's no question that reputation matters, and it matters in a very tangible financial terms. Now the fine folks over at Reputation Institute, or the RepTrack now, they've rebranded, will tell you things like, because they've been tracking thousands of companies for 30 years, they've run all the regression models, they can tell you that a single point shift in a reputation score will generally yield as much as 2% bump in market cap. That's huge. That's about $1 billion for like the average company that they're tracking. So reputation matters, there's no question. And this idea that we can't measure it and we can't relate it back to a financial, KPI is hogwash. So, but while reputation matters, like our view is that the traditional ways of measuring it and the traditional ways of defining it, at least on their own, are aging and can be limiting. Now, to be fair, so we say relevance matters too. We work with many clients who are tracking reputation as well as relevance. Some are tracking one, some are tracking the other. Okay, value in both. So whereas reputation, though, is measured based on survey data, reported perceptions, relevance is measuring actual observed digital behavior and content gaps. So neither right nor wrong, different, approaching the same question from slightly different angles. And so for us, we look at relevance as telemetry. It's a radar for an organization. It can be done with agility. It's immediately actionable because it's inherently digital. And so not just philosophically, but our point of view is that what does relevant mean in this context? I mean, the word is obvious, but it means that you're, as an organization, you're thought about, you're sought out, you're talked about, you are engaged with, and you're believed in both generally and on specific topics that matter not so much to you as an organization, but matter to your stakeholders. So we're instantly sort of tuning into and keeping track of the stakeholders. So I keep coming back to that theme. So it's a combination of quantitative scoring and deep engagement tracking, content analysis, linguistics, some human, some AI. And in a sense, it's a giant form of a gap analysis because it maps and closes that gap between organizations and stakeholders. In particular, what is an organization out there with? What do they need to be saying, want to be saying? What is their platform? And I mean more than strictly positioning or messaging. I mean more than strictly a campaign platform. In this case, think Dove's women's body imagery and what that means to them as a high-level overarching umbrella platform, and then all of the individual little campaigns that can hang underneath that and hang together. So it's about, what is Dove out there with versus what do their stakeholders expect of them, and there sure better not be a gap. It better be an intersection, and so relevance is that intersection. Ultimately, it again acknowledges and taps into sort of a social, political, cultural currency and urgency, and so it helps organizations sort of constantly tune into context and the reality of stakeholders. It invites action, it invites engagement. So that's, believe it or not, the short version of what relevance is. Now we've been, it's new to W2O comparatively. We've been tracking it for 3 years, 240 companies, sort of Fortune 100 and then 140 healthcare companies. And so when you track that many companies for 3 years, you really do get a feel for patterns, like the anatomy of what a relevant company looks like, both kind of pre-2020 and certainly now. And so I'll get to social injustice and COVID in a moment, but in looking at kind of data 3 years pre-COVID, there are some core tenets of relevance that still stand evergreen, that will continue to stand. And what we've noticed is, because we get this question all the time from clients, the biggest predictor of how resilient an organization is during a crisis is to have been relevant and resilient before a crisis. There's just a particular way of thinking, feeling, behaving, acting, communicating as an organization, what's prioritized, what's valued, that continues to hold true even amidst a crisis. You might be acting with more agility, might be making more decisions more quickly, but it's the same basic idea. So you don't immediately, instantly, because of a crisis, with a few exceptions, become relevant, nor drive your reputation, up. So consistency and momentum is key. Generally, and I'll get to social injustice in a minute, but generally relevant organizations, they are constantly kind of looking at and sharpening their narrative, their positioning and messaging, their platforms. Increasingly, seems obvious, but there's often a gap between the internal and the external narrative. So what story is the financial analyst community seeing that maybe the employees are not seeing? And do we need to close that gap? So companies are intensifying a focus on their values and on purpose. There's that word again. They are using data to embolden themselves to take maybe a stronger than historical position on a stand. Again, they're recognizing that stakeholders are urging them to do this. They're leveraging stakeholders, engaging them as part of the solution. They are intensifying employee engagement and advocacy. Again, folks are figuring out that put the right content in the right tools, the right way, the right frequency in front of employees, and they will help tell your story and amplify it for you externally. So companies are embracing storytelling, not so much as a tactic historically, but a strategic management skill now. So we're seeing an uptick in executive thought leadership. And, you know, seems cliche to say, you mentioned it off the top with frameworks cross-peso, but always on, fully integrated, the right content on the right channel at the right time with the right kind of outcome in mind. And so I'll get to COVID in a moment, but real quick, you asked about the social injustice lens that we put on this recently through this report. So we've been tracking the corporate relevance through the lens of diversity and inclusion broadly for a number of years. And so recently, as the social injustice issues, 400 years in the making, mind you, but recently brought to the foreground with George Floyd surfaced, we examined CEO and company responses to all that. And with an eye to, like, frankly, who rocked and who kind of misstepped, and what does that look like? And therefore, what kind of guidance could we give to clients? And we found that seems obvious, but silence is not an option. Nobody gets to sit this one out. And that everyone, regardless of what kind of organization you are, has a stake in this. Again, stakeholders are demanding that companies act, actions louder than words, all that. We found more specifically that CEOs needed to go beyond kind of the statement, which is increasingly, even pre-COVID, just ringing empty. A colleague of mine calls this the cliched platitudes from white dudes, and going beyond blackwashing, beyond performative activism. So you got to get it right. You need to get out there and say something. More importantly, do something, but it's got to be authentic and genuine. So we looked at company responses that really did get it right, and I'll share some with you that missed. And what did they do? What's interesting is that most seemed to be able to embrace a little bit of discomfort on this topic. Just like as we would talk about it as friends at a cocktail party. It's uncomfortable, it's hard, but we have to do it. They embraced listening, they embraced learning, they took a stand, they owned where they fell short, they focused on transparency, they focused on the long term too, not just an initial knee-jerk reaction. And they focused on periodic, a commitment to rolling back out periodically with some sort of measurable accountability. We told you we're going to do these 5 things, and then in the next 4 months, we're going to roll back out with you, hold ourselves accountable, and show you how far we got. And they shifted policy more than anything. They responded with, and this is true of COVID too, we'll come back to this, but like with empathy, with humility, the responses were aligned with their core values and their purpose. So there was a humanizing effect here. And gosh, but donations and pledges, companies got out their checkbook, did they ever, in a big way, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in some ways. But it wasn't just random acts of corporate giving. These were really thoughtful, targeted funds, like supporting new business development for African Americans, or defense funds, or NAACP, and so on. So just really smart, well-targeted partnerships from a financial perspective. More importantly, though, I think they used their size and their scale, their platform, to get out there and take a stand. And their response initiatives were multi-pronged. It wasn't just sort of 1 or 2 things. They were, and so these were, thoughtful plans, not just kind of optically checking a box. Thankfully, the companies that tried that, I think, got called out real quick by their stakeholders. There's an interesting, back to this employees, and employees not just as a single discrete stakeholder, but there's this like bottom-up effect where if employees got the vibe that their company wasn't doing anything or doing enough or doing it in an authentic way, man, did they call leadership out and demand change and movement from the bottom up. So I think the organizations that got this right were mindful of kind of the core tenets of relevance all along. Engage all your stakeholders, stay true to your purpose and values. And so that's the social injustice findings. I know we'll move on here in a few moments to the COVID lens on this.
Absolutely. So Alan, I want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room. And that's just we are living in unprecedented times between the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the recent instances of civil unrest that are totally I think changing the social fabric that defines this country. And I think many from afar are observing the public relations function, which in and of itself is going through a transformation of its own. So a question on that for you, Alan. Your clients that you're working with, perhaps in the healthcare sector, especially given the fact that many of them are just on the front lines of all this activity, what are the biggest ways in which they are and have been impacted by COVID-19, specifically from a public relations and strategic communication standpoint? Is what they're doing today different from what they were doing before, or is this a continuation of their role?
It's more continuum than wholesale change. They are certainly the busiest they've ever been, these companies in the healthcare sector in particular. What it did do, though, was, again, this is not a change so much as an accelerant or a double, triple down. It profoundly heightened expectations among stakeholders and what they're looking for and how they want to be engaged with and involved in the solutions. And I'll break this apart kind of internally and externally, if I could. And internally, it's accelerated some of the macro trends that were happening long before COVID, digital transformation, for example. And so if you think of bringing thousands of employees home indefinitely, maybe forever, in some cases, how do you, from a technology perspective, enable that if you hadn't thought through that before? Communications and culturally, though, like how do you engage them? How do you continue to form and advance a common culture remotely? I think companies, including ours, we're challenged by this, and we're experimenting with all sorts of things. You can only have so many Zoom happy hours a week. I mean, they were fun initially, but kind of wearing a bit thin. And even you all earlier this week released results of a study that said executives think employees are more engaged than they are. Okay, there's a gap. So that's certainly something that we should be measuring more frequently and doing something about. So I think that was a bit of a surprise. Now, sort of bridging to the external space, externally, consumers are really watching how companies are treating their employees. And there was that sort of now famous Mark Cuban quote that how brands treat their employees now will profoundly determine how customers vote with their wallets, their hearts, and their feet for these companies 10 years from now. I think there's some truth to that. It makes a ton of sense. And so externally, though, expectations are massively high. Companies generally, healthcare in particular, stakeholders, again, are looking for pharma companies to provide solutions, quite literally here, in the form of testing and vaccines. This is, it's put an intense amount of pressure on and scrutiny on companies and their CEOs like never before. So thoughtful, strategic, well-timed communications is not new. Executive thought leadership is not new, but gosh, there's really pressure on to do it properly now and well thought out. And so I think there are some organizations that have, missed the mark here for sure. But generally, I think companies, and I'm quite pleased and sort of proud of our profession here, Mo, that most companies' communications and stakeholder engagement has been pretty thoughtful. Some missteps, some wobbles, but they've learned along the way and over time, and they've dug in for the long haul here. And so we looked at patterns in particular of companies that either remained relevant or increased in relevance over time during amidst COVID. And there were a couple of key findings here, some sort of captain obvious, but some a little more subtle and nuanced. The first is that, a cliche, but my God, actions louder than words. Statements, no thank you, do something. In fact, it's okay as an organization to just go and do it and not tell anyone that you've done it or then make a big darn deal about it, just go do it. So, focus on benevolent behavior more than positioning. This is not an opportunistic marketing moment. We cannot issue jack this. We have to do the right things for all of our stakeholders, not just employees. I think this is where some companies got into trouble. Their first step was employee safety, send all our employees home. Okay, how about customers? How about investors? So on and so forth. And I think we saw companies really lean in, Mo, to more focused engagement than mass communications, again, away from the spray and pray. And good response initiatives were robust, multi-pronged, multifaceted. They were long-term. Transparency was a thing. That's comparatively new for the healthcare industry versus some of the others, and equally new too, at least in the way that some of these companies did this. There were some unexpected partnerships, some strange bedfellows as it relates to innovations. So Medtronic and Elon Musk, who knew that Tesla, that those organizations would partner on solutions. So I think more importantly though, like relevant organizations took some risks and got human. They empathized, they got emotional, they got personal. They demonstrated that they understood the experience of us and our families sheltering in place. They recognized that we're getting tired, we're getting stressed, we're getting anxious, certainly uncertain. And so they connected with us, the good ones did, on an emotional and experiential level. I promised I wouldn't name names, but I'll do it anyway. It's not a client. Procter & Gamble, so many really good examples, but this one in particular where they tapped into the cultural phenomenon that is TikTok. I don't know about you and your family, and we are now horribly, horribly addicted, given the time spent at home. Addicted in a good way. We know all the dances and all the songs. So, but P&G, again, tapping into a sense of political, cultural, societal, economic urgency, and all the mashup of all of those things right now, tapped into that cultural phenomenon of TikTok with their distance dance video, and it garnered, wait for this, we shouldn't be measuring quite this way, forgive me, but I'll do it just this once, 8.7 billion views and significant engagement. It's a perfect example of an organization in a non-obtrusive, non-obnoxious, non-issue jacking sort of way, understanding the current climate and context and putting something out there. How do they do that? Data, research. On the flip side, so we looked at patterns in what was driving corporate relevance down, and three things principally: dormancy, latency, and inconsistency. Here's what I mean by that. Dormancy is this idea that if you weren't particularly relevant pre-crisis, then it'll be very tricky for you to establish that all of a sudden. So relevance is hard to gain, it's hard to keep, it's quick and easy to lose, particularly absent kind of an always-on, evergreen strategy, all channels, all stakeholders. And so companies that found themselves kind of dragged out into the spotlight and that were back on their heels or on the defensive really struggled to catch and keep their footing. Latency, so there really was a first mover advantage in some of these cases. So the CEO of Delta rolling out as the first to forego his own salary to help pay expenses. Brilliant, huge reaction to that. But guess what happened to the second, third, fourth, fifth, and 12th company that tried that 2 weeks later? Failed because it was perceived as optics, as they were furloughing other employees.
Right.
So, first movers have advantage. Inconsistency. So again, just this idea that to be resilient during is to have been relevant before. And there's a few exceptions, companies that seem to sort of pop out of nowhere onto a top 20 list, but they've popped back out just as fast as they came in. And so it'll be very tricky to sustain that. So we really did see some leaderboard shifts, some shifts in the rankings in the recent years. Again, I won't name names, but we did see some jockeying and jostling, minor, with kind of some of the usual suspects. So if you're in the top 20 for the last 2 years, you will continue to be in 2020. There were some that for exceptional reasons, again, came out of nowhere and popped in, popped back out. So COVID has definitely moved the needle. it has heightened expectations of organizations from a thought leadership perspective, from a prove that you're doing something to help me, help society perspective. And if I could take a quick sidestep into reputation just for a moment, a colleague of mine over here has, excuse me, a slide that's become kind of infamous in pitch decks, and it notes that something like, it's old data now granted, but something like 9%, only 9% of Americans believe that pharma companies put patients above profit, only 9%. But something like 15% of Americans believe in Bigfoot, Yeti, or Sasquatch. Okay, so that's a challenge. That's the environment that these large healthcare companies are having to encounter. Now, on the other hand, if you look at some of the fine research coming out of the Harris poll, and Rob Ukalik, who also sits on our Institute for PR Measurement Commission, and I imagine maybe he's your next stop for your next conversation here, he'll tell you better than I will that there really is what they're calling a once in a generational inflection point on healthcare reputation. It's not back to the heydays of the 80s, but there certainly is a bump and a shift. Why? Consumers' perceptions of companies' efforts around things like testing and vaccine development and so on. So it's a unique and important opportunity and moment for healthcare companies to sort of step up and step into this, but there's a ton of pressure. And so now the question becomes, how sustainable is that, and what companies do from here in terms of meeting those stakeholder expectations is really where the rubber hits the road here, and what's going to be interesting to watch. And I think, again, the good news is that it has really helped organizations sharpen their narratives, sharpen how they're thinking about using data to engage stakeholders, what's working, what's not, tuning in, and it's really humanized many of these healthcare brands in all the right ways, I think.
Appreciate that insight, Alan. So I think for today we've come to the conclusion of our time. I do want to ask one more question as we wrap up, which I think many of our measurement geeks with the IPRMC are wondering about.
Yep.
And that pertains to measurement. So I think many folks are wondering, with a period of time where the news cycle is dominated by COVID-19, how does one even go about measuring public relations efforts? Do the old tried and true approaches of measuring, share of voice using typical media monitoring sources, or other approaches more innovatively that companies like Cision have come out with that track the reach of individual press releases, et cetera.
Right.
I mean, is this going to have to change during a period of time where if you use those tactics, it will look as if nothing is working? So how is measurement for public relations going to change with respect to all of the activity related to COVID?
I think ask a different measurement practitioner, you may get a different answer, but and my answer might be a bit contrarian and a bbit flip. When I say, will it change? Yes and no. Here's what I mean. Strategically, no, it will not change. Tactically, it absolutely has to change. Here's the difference is this. Strategically, good measurement is good measurement is good measurement. We know what that looks like, and measurement's never been more important than now. We need that telemetry to help us tune into those stakeholders and stay focused on that purpose. We might do it more frequently. We might do it more thoughtfully, more deeply, with more agility. So that's an incremental innovation, let's say. It's not a wholesale change to a robust, well thought out measurement frame that goes well past just a media and a social media perspective and into, like, what are your stakeholders, where are they at? And again, we need to be spotting gaps, like this example, between the executives thinking their employees are more engaged than they are. So tactically, will measurement change? Yes, it will. It has already. Methods, maybe not so much, but as we think of measuring across paid, earned, shared, owned channels, yes, there is some difference. One of the more common questions we're getting internally is, do any of my old benchmarks still hold water in any way, shape, or form? No, not really, but does that matter? I mean, I'm less interested in benchmarks on things like clicks, likes, and comments and shares, kind of the low end operational, how well is the content performing stuff? Great, go measure that, keep doing that. what we're advising clients to do is to stay focused on that stakeholder. What is that stakeholder seeing, thinking, feeling, doing, wanting? And always, always, always focus on that now more than ever. And I think that requires all sorts of different methods to do that, whether that's reputation, relevance, or deep linguistics on social content, on and on and on. So I think, kind of like being resilient during a crisis means being relevant before crisis. Good measurement during this crisis was to have had a sound measurement framework and approach thought out before. It's not particularly the right time to be scrambling and creating a measurement framework net new where there wasn't one before. It's sort of the wrong exercise. But it is compelling some organizations to think more smartly about what they're measuring, how frequently. So it's been a win that way.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Alan. And with that, I think we have a wrap. Thanks so much for your time. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think we shared many insights that will be relevant to the general practitioner, to the measurement geeks, and of course, we do this video series as an ongoing contributions to the broader strategic communications community. We've heard for years that while there is great content out there for especially newer and younger practitioners, that it's oftentimes buried, inaccessible, not easy to consume.
Yeah.
So that's our dedication. Our dedication to this video series is to just make it easier to understand how experts like Alan are navigating these challenging times, and how as a new practitioner, you can do the same. So with that, Alan, I think we're all set for today. Thanks so much for your participation.
It's my pleasure. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. We'll be back at you. We're doing this just about bi-weekly, so you'll hear from us soon. Thanks again.